Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Analyst, an ONTABA podcast curated here in Ontario about behavior analysis within the province. This is super exciting. This is the rebirth of the podcast. We started this podcast a couple of years ago. We've taken a couple of years hiatus for multiple reasons, but we're back. So we're excited to be back. I'm excited to be disseminating more behavior analysis with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jaime Santana. I'm a registered behavior analyst in Ontario. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst in Ontario. I work with youth and adults with developmental disabilities. I have been involved with the board for a decade now. I've been a board member for multiple years, and I am the past president of ONTABA. And I'm super excited to get this podcast going. Again, I'm also super excited to be joined today by Dr. Ida Chung. She is a doctorate level BCBA and an RBA in Ontario. Ida has been working in the field of behavior analysis across clinical, research, and educational settings. Over the course of her career, Ida has developed extensive experience supporting individuals across the lifespan. She's also the founder of Glowing Growth, which is an ABA clinic based in Markham, where she leads the team dedicating to providing ABA services. In addition to her clinical work, Ida is a part-time professor at Durham College. A key area of Ida's interest and expertise is relational frame theory. She is passionate about making RFT more approachable and less intimidating, helping practitioners and the general public better understand how language and cognition develop through everyday interactions. And I'm super excited to have that conversation because I'm a little bit of an RFT nerd myself. So welcome, Ida, to The Analyst.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you for the kind words. I'm so excited to be here.
This is going to be a pretty exciting chat, I think. To get us started, can you give us a little insight as to how you got into ABA, what ABA looked like when you started in the field, and what you're currently focusing on other than RFT?
Of course. When I first started, it was actually very interesting. So I used to work at a daycare after I graduated from my undergrad. And at that time, ABA wasn't something popular. I had my first contact with an individual in the daycare who was diagnosed with autism. And I tried my best to really, connect with them, connect with her, and then, talking to her, but she wasn't really responding to me. But every time there would be, a girl coming in, and then she would do anything. She would communicate. She would, start her work, do any task, talk to that particular girl, right? So I started talking to the girl and I found that, oh, she's an ABA therapist. And that was, really interesting. So I started continuing my education and I registered in Seneca College for their autism and behavioral science program. Then that's the time when I was talking to my sister through, a conversation. And then she was like, hey, do you know that I'm a BCBA? I'm like, what? Like, really? She was like, yeah, so yes. But the thing is, because ABA wasn't popular, it wasn't something that would come up as, a career at that point, right? Like it wasn't something that we would ever talk about. She usually just tell me, oh, I work with kids with autism. And that's kind of is how we frame it, and that's it. So then from then on, we started talking more and more about ABA all the time. Autistic individuals, we talk a lot about work. Then I started, really getting really into the field. And then I started getting my master. And after my master, I got my PhD in behavior analysis as well, because I really, really like this field and I really love the work that we do. It's very meaningful to me. Then I started my clinic. And after working in the clinic for a while, I also noticed that there's a, bigger gap between theory and experience as well. And of course, at that time when I started working in my clinic, there wasn't a lot of, exposure to ABA. Most people, didn't really know ABA at all. And it's great. Like we've come a very long way now that being recognized and people started to talk about ABA. But again, I feel that that reputation that we had, it's still not the greatest a lot of times, right? People frame us as, training robots. We're too systematic. We're too rigid. And that's actually is one of the reasons why I really like RFT, because this is something that people don't see what we can do and what, our theory have provided us with. And these, I think it's worth advocating definitely for our field.
That's amazing. It's super interesting how, you went from not knowing what ABA was, even though your sister was an active BCBA. That's super interesting. And I feel like that description of I work with kids with autism is the same description that I give to my entire family. I'm just like,
Right.
I work with people with developmental disabilities. That's the kind of services we give. And I feel like that has been the pathway until recently, right? Like with
100%.
registration happening, I feel like the career as a behavior analyst is starting to expand and more people are hearing about that. That's a super interesting story. And you touched a little bit about RFT. So,
Mhm.
what is it other than the flexibility of RFT? What is it about RFT that got you fired up about it? What gave you that passion for RFT?
Like I said, because earlier in our field, right, people again feel that we're very rigid and we train things are very systematic. Everything kind of needs to be trained in that sense. And a lot of times too, people actually explain AB in a sense where once you get into it, you don't get out of it
Yeah,
because that's just how they are, right? Like, and I don't think that's true. When I'm training my kiddos, the individuals that I work with, I want to teach them the skill that they are able to learn naturally, that they don't need me. Like, I would be more than happy to say that they've graduated from the
yeah,
program, right? Like, I don't want you to rely on me forever. And I find that like RFT, it's the way to go because when you're able to think independently, when you're able to relate, what you have learned to new things, then the generalized responses are there. And when you do that, you basically are able to kind of make things like connect things together, think more broadly in a sense. And then as a result, you're able to kind of learn naturally, just like, all of us, right?
yeah.
And I think that's really strong.
Yeah, I think the generalizability of RFT and the derived responding that comes with it really does support with with skill development, but I think particularly for language development and for behavior analysts, most of us are very well versed in verbal behavior. The
Right.
man, the tact, the
Yeah. Yeah.
interverbal, right? We're very well versed. We understand it front and back. We get how it helps develop language, right? Um, but RFT is also important for language development. So why is RFT important to language development, and how can clinicians use it more readily in ABA?
So within RFT, one thing that we really always talk about is derived relational responding, right? So basically, when a response is not being taught directly to them, when you're able to make relations between different responses, and then therefore you have a new response, a novel response that you've never, been taught before, and you're still going to be able to understand it, use it in, the right way. And that sounds familiar, and that's just generalized operants in ABA, right? It's something that we've been doing, but it feels like it's a foreign language because it's a kind of newer theory principle, but it's not. It's something that we've been doing the whole time. I think it's just a different way of framing it. So the good thing about this is when you are, understanding the different relations between different things, you start thinking a lot more. Right? So within RFT, we always talk about how this is the language development and also cognitive skill development. Okay? Because you're constantly thinking, processing the information, making the information connect with another information that you have, experienced before, and therefore you're going to be able to make new relations. And once you're able to make that new relations, your generativity of that language becomes so broad. There's infinite ways to, to that particular response that you've once learned. It's just so broad, so big that you can actually get into. But you first need to understand the concept. You first need to understand how we're able to make that derived relational responding.
Yeah, and when I started learning about RFT, we were I was really interested in how, you know, stimulus equivalence was really like it wasn't the same, but it was really closely related to the relational frame theory topic of entailment. So you did say it was a different language, but it was the same. So instead of symmetry, right? You would probably use like a mutual entailment. That was the kind of
Correct.
comparison.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So instead of transformation. It was combinatorial entailment. So
Correct.
that was the language that was different. How was it that you were able to bring both of those together and kind of make sense of it when you started learning RFT?
Right. So I think it's interesting also to mention that when I was doing my master, that task list before, there was no RFT, there was no
Hmm.
derived relational responding, right? And in that case, really, stimulus equivalence is all we have closest to, RFT at that point. So never heard of it before, obviously, until I actually started using a curriculum called Peak, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But with the derived relational responding, I think the stimulus equivalence is the basis of that. Right? Because you understand A equals B equals C, and therefore, without teaching, you also understand that A equals C. Right? With RFT, it's a little bit different with the language. We don't necessarily use the word equal,
Hmm.
and we use the word infer, right? Because they just have a relations, but they don't equal. It's not that, you would have a dog, a picture of the dog, and it equals you actually seeing a dog, right? It's actually not the same. The feelings, the emotions that are being evoked are very different when you're looking at a picture. So when we talk about inference, right, it's about okay, well, it evokes that sort of, similar relations, but you understand the relations, but it's not exactly the same. And that's kind of is what we're looking at within RFT is there is a togetherness, there is a sameness to it, but it's not 100% equal. Versus with stimulus equivalent, it is, equal in
Yeah.
that sense, right? In your response. So I think it's, you know, for people who just started learning RFT, that could be difficult to understand. And I can understand why then people always compare that to stimulus equivalence and thinking that this is just an extension of stimulus equivalence, is nothing new, it's just a new language. But to me, I think there are a lot more to that
Yeah.
than just stimulus equivalence. I think stimulus equivalent is definitely the basis of it. You got to have to understand that, stimulus equivalent, the triangle before you get into relational frame theory. And within the RFT as well, when we're looking at the frames, there are different ways of, relating things. It's not just always one thing equals another. There's, a comparison, distinction comparison is, when you compare one thing to another, right? When you know that I am, older than my daughter, when my mom is older than me, then you know that my mom is older than my daughter and my daughter is younger than my mom, right? Those type of relations is what RFT is aiming for. It's not always equal. You are able to kind of reverse that language in another sense. When you use older than you use younger than, bigger than you use smaller than, right?
Yeah.
There's, a lot of different frames within the RFT that's really looks very different than stimulus equivalence.
And a couple of things that we can take from that. You mentioned two really important words. Framing and experience, right? And although we could all agree that the word dog means the same as the picture of a dog, means the same as a real life dog, the experience or the way we look at that experience when we see it is going to be different person to person. So when I see a dog or when somebody else sees a dog, they might see that as like, oh, that memory of the time I got chased by a dog when I was little. So now I'm scared. Whereas other people might look at it and be like, oh, what a cute little cuddly puppy, right? So that experience is different. The context within which you've learned about the dog is different. So with all that kind of history of learning being pulled into what this stimulus brings, because it could be either an establishing operation or an abolishing operation. How do you describe that? How do you introduce that to new staff or to new people who are coming into the RFT world?
I think you have definitely touched on a really good point, and bringing in even more important words into this is the word contextual. Obviously, it's all about functional contextualism. Eh? And when we talk about contextual, it's something that has the same meaning to you, doesn't have to be having the same meaning to me, right? When we're teaching individuals, understanding their experience or how they understand language, we really do have to understand it in their perspective. Right? Something that, like, again, with the dog experience, if I've never even seen a dog before, or if I've never been chased by a dog before, I don't know what you mean by scared. I'm not
Hmm.
scared, right? And you keep telling me, okay, when you see a dog, run away, but like, why? Like, I think they're cute, or my experience with the dog, it's like always pleasant. So I wouldn't have the same experience in you, and it's very different. And I think this might be one of the hardest thing um, when it comes to teaching, because we really do have to understand the context in which these relations are being derived and these relations are being taught. So again, it's more than just a direct experience. You really have to, you know, understand a lot of history, understand the learning profile even of the individuals that you're trying to teach, understand how you put these, relations together. And during, teaching, sometimes you also need to understand how they have been already putting this relation in place first, and whether or not those relations, it's meaningful or it's harmful for them in some ways. Like, you gotta have to understand that before you can teach the new step. I don't think RFT or contextual learning is something that it's going to have to be by the book, like it's this and then that, right? Like, I don't think there's that exists in our book, and that's sometimes might be more difficult, and sometimes it take a little bit more time for behavioral analysts to understand what that individual is, has experienced and what you're trying to target.
Yeah, and I think where that was really helpful for me clinically was when we're talking about stimulus pairing, right? So some
Yeah.
families are like, we all enjoy doing this, the client, we would love for the client to join us in doing this, and I'm like, right, and all of that makes sense, but the thing that you're doing involves a really loud sound that they're scared of. So now every time they see that game board, or every time they see the hockey game, or every time they see that, all they think about is, and they're on edge, waiting for that negative thing to happen. So the experience is different. And kind of explaining that to families and letting them know, like, hey, we might have to work on other things before we get there. RFT has really helped me with that. Have you found a similar experience with you and with other skills?
100%. I think, we talk about stimulus control a lot too within behavior analysis, right? And with um, contextualism and RFT, stimulus control looks very different. Stimulus control can be coming from the within that we don't know, because it comes, like, the stimulus control comes with how am I putting the relations together? If you are putting the relations together using comparison frame, you think this, apple is bigger than the other apple, and therefore you think it's better. But for me, I think that this is smaller, but it looks redder, and I like it better because in my experience, I think the redder the apple, the better it is. That kind of relations that we're putting together, even though we're using the same relations because of our experience, because of the context that are given within that experience, we will have different decision making, right? We'll have a different results in our decision, and therefore the outcome will be different, the response will be different. But we're not right or wrong in that sense. We're just in our own context, in our own responses.
Yeah.
Eh? And that's really, it's helpful to understand, because a lot of times, again, if you have your perspective and this is what you're looking at and you're feeling, and you can't always expect the other person to have the exact same experience as you and therefore make the same decision, right? I don't know if you have, ever have experience with just talking to a family members or a friend, then they are able to finish your sentence, or even without knowing what you're going to say, they already know how to answer you. It's because you share the same experience, because within that context they know exactly what you're referring to, versus there is always going to be another member who's like, what is he talking about,
Yeah.
right? But that person is able to just click and know, because you share that experience, and that context allowed him to actually make the relations, and then therefore he knows what you're trying to say, versus the other one didn't have that context, so the relation that they're making are completely different.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's a really good way. We've talked a lot about a lot of examples of RFT and how it can be applied in an ABA setting. But like with any intervention, there's also some misconceptions that come with RFT. So what are some
Perfect.
common misconceptions that you've stumbled across that has been brought up to you when you're working on these things or introducing it to somebody new?
I think one of the ones is definitely being, just the same as stimulus equivalents, and teaching it exactly the same way as stimulus equivalents. everything being, just the same. I
Yeah.
think when you kind of understand it in that sense, your teaching then actually becomes more rigid, eh? Because, there's only one way, but we know that there's many ways. Another thing is RFT is too complex, is too much of a new, language, too theoretical, it doesn't work. It replaces the traditional ABA teaching. I don't think it does. It's complements it, right? Like
Yeah.
it adds on to it. It makes it better. And it's part of ABA. RFT is part of ABA. It's what we actually need to remember and know, right? I think in reality, RFT builds on what we already are doing, and extends it in other ways to kind of promote that generalization. It helps us structure how the learning could be like. It helps them to kind of do more of the natural learning. I think that's really important to understand, and that RFT actually goes beyond stimulus equivalence. Sure, it has some components of stimulus equivalent 100%, but it's definitely not the same, and we need to understand it and accept that there is new ways to teach and can, teach that language generativity using RFT, using derived relational responding.
Those are really interesting. Some really interesting, and I kind of felt the same when I was introduced to RFT, and I was like, you know, why are we going from equivalence to come like entailments? Why are we changing up the language? But as you begin to kind of unwrap what those actually mean, the words are different because the concept is different, right? We're talking about how from the word dog, for example, we could pull off hundreds of other words or feelings or emotions that come from that word dog. Similarly, when we talk about like foods and drinks and music, you could pull so many different things. One song could remind you of that vacation you took in 2018
Hmm.
when you were right. So that pulling out that difference and how it becomes a lot more inner verbal behavior as well, how that becomes involved is really kind of interesting and kind of separates the two.
Right. And there's
Um,
actually one more thing.
yeah.
Um, like I think one of the most common misconcepts about RFT is that it's too mentalist.
Yes.
And ABA people don't necessarily love the word being so mentalist, right? To us, it's like, oh, well, you're touching upon their feelings, their emotions, and I don't know what they're thinking, right? So, well, this is not, part of ABA. Well, we're still looking into, the actual responses they're giving. It's still measurable. It's still, observable. Yes, we look at what we call cognition. It sounds, something like what we don't do, but actually, no, like it's part of language. It's still part of flexible behaviors. It's still part of, the cognition. And they all come together at the end of the day. Again, we're still looking at that outcome, that measurable and observable behaviors that after all those relations,
Yeah.
put together in their head, what are they doing? Right? Like I think it's one of the things that people also kind of struggle to understand is feeling that, oh, this is not something that what we do.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, that term mentalistic, because I've heard that a lot as well when we're talking about things like acceptance and commitment training, when we're talking about things like RFT, which mesh so well together as well as interventions. And as behavior, and you're right, behavior analysts kind of shy away from that without realizing that one of the driving forces of ABA is pretty mentalistic, and that is motivation, right? We don't know
Hmm.
what anybody's motivated for until they give us signals, until there is a
Exactly.
permanent product, until there's something visible. And it's the same thing with like emotions or feelings, right? Whatever we're not able to pick up from body language, we may be able to pick up from spoken language, right? By simply asking like, what are you feeling right now?
Exactly.
Right? Like we gotta learn. I think we gotta be a little bit more comfortable in self-reports in some situations to help develop skills.
Yeah, I agree too. I think a lot of these, mental health challenges sometimes are rooted in how we relate our thoughts, our feelings, experience through language per
Yeah.
se, right? And this is something that we're still able to teach, right? We don't kind of just experience the events, just have emotions and everything. It's we have to understand the events, we evaluate the events, we compare the events, and we connect them to different moments in our life, and that's exactly what RFT is, right?
And one of the things that you mentioned is language, and I think that's a really interesting and important part about RFT, and potentially one of the limitations of RFT. So let's dive into that. What are some of the limitations of RFT, and how can we make that those limitations less impactful?
I think when RFT offers that really, strong and powerful way for us to understand the language, cognition, and behaviors, sometimes it's also feels more abstract and difficult to translate in our everyday practice.
Yeah,
And what we talk about, yeah, their experience, their emotions, and how they're presenting those. Of course, it can be measured and it can be, observed by a third party, but obviously not all of them are. And sometimes when we're trying to work on the outcomes, the behaviors that we're able to see, we kind of have to look into the roots of how this is happening. Right. And I think, behavior analysts sometimes might really not be equipped with that skill in a sense to kind of look into that mental, that internal or conceptual idea. Like as much as we have some understanding even through RFT, we know how they make the relations. Sometimes it's really difficult to just target those relations from the outside. Of course, with the implementation of ACT, we're not trying to, help them to eliminate that thoughts. We're trying to teach them to accept the thoughts. We're trying to let them to understand that you have the thoughts and it's okay, right? We're not trying to tell you that don't think like that, right? We're trying to tell them that, okay, you think like that, but it's okay. That just understand that you have the thought. Notice that the thought is there. Right? And it helps us to kind of focus on that relational networking, the meaning behind it, the contextual control, right? But sometimes, again, for clinicians, for behavior analysts, sometimes it's very difficult to just directly observe those as comparison to other, traditional ABA
yeah.
strategies or targets or discrete responses. So it makes it really difficult, I think, for clinician to implement RFT, particularly on that, mental health perspective, I think.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it is really difficult. Where you're right, we're not trained to deal with mental health challenges or mental health concerns. And the reality is that a lot of our clients, especially for those of us who work within the developmental disability sector, the comorbidity of the two is pretty high. So, understanding the language that's being used, understanding how our language could impact our clients is really important. Um, and I think we definitely need more training and more growth there. The other limitation that I've kind of found is that we can't really implement RFT with every client the way we would be able to implement reinforcement with every
Right.
client, right? How do you work or navigate around RFT interventions or some aspect of RFT intervention for those clients with more basic early language, or who have an intellectual disability that may not allow, or that may cause difficulties for them to have these relational frames or have the conversations needed to point out these relational frames.
I think you bring up a really good point that because RFT it's more advanced language, right? Like when you're able to kind of, bridge the language and when you're kind of able to make relations, you first have to have the understanding of the language, right? So sometimes with some of those individuals that we work with, maybe they don't have that prerequisite to start. And therefore, you just can't use RFT for everyone.
Of course.
And I can see that too, right? But that's also when, RFT is strong, where we say that you still first have to have those concrete, direct training first, right? Those are the training that we're able to give. And we're able to train those solid trained relations first prior to we moving on to understanding how they're able to make those derived relational responding. Sure, RFT itself kind of understand that derived relational responding, but within that, I think we also as clinicians need to understand that the very first step is always teach that solid skill. If you don't even understand an apple is an apple, if this thing is small and that thing is big, there's no comparison, right? I think that is and it's very important to remember that it still kind of have a progression, and because derived relational responding could be understanding as generalized operands as well, it's almost like a further step that we can do later on, of course, with individuals that you know are able to understand language further. We're able to just embed it right away at the beginning and just kind of use multiple exemplar
Yeah.
trainings. Even I find that with instructive feedback, it's very helpful for them. Right? Because every time when they have a correct response given, and after that correct response is given, you give them kind of an extra little bit idea of something else, right? And sometimes because of the momentum that they have, because they're already in that, momentum of getting the correct responses, understanding in their learning phase, that they kind of understand what you're saying, outside of that instructions as well. And giving that instructive feedback would really bridge that nicely, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you're right. I think there's always a starting point for everybody, and of course, not everybody is gonna get to the point where we are, talking about mutual entailments, and making these really large word webs of thoughts, feelings, emotions, and other memories that are coming up. But when it comes to generalized language, I think a lot of us and a lot of the clients we work with can get there, whether that is spoken, signed, or image-based communication, alternative devices, etc. And you mentioned earlier peak as well. And
Yes.
that's kind of what got me into the RFT world. That's
Same
kind of what
here.
drew me in there with attending a peak training. What has been
Mhm.
your experience with peak? What has been like? What are some of the success stories that you've seen with peak
And
when it comes to language and decision making and all those other fun things?
that's also how I first started understanding RFT. I think at that point I didn't even know what RFT is. Like I was just, attending the peak training and thought, okay, well, this is a good way to train those, responses, be flexible, right? So that I got that. And, if anyone who have used Peak before, you know that there are four different modules. There's the direct training where you focus on the early learning through reinforcement, right? Just exactly what we're talking about. Prior to moving on to the derived relational responding, you need to have the solid skill. Right?
Yeah.
And then they have the generalization where it targets really just stimulus generalization across the different contexts, so you understand, similar stimulus and what they look like and generalize and still able to respond. Then they go into equivalence where they kind of build that symbolic behavior and the true language, right? Understanding the simple derived relational responding already without directly teaching to them. Then finally goes into transformation where it's actually focused on those RFT framing to target reasoning, problem solving, and flexible cognition. Okay? That is like Peak is still one of the only available curriculum right now that teaches derived relational responding. It's kind of has a progression, and I really like that it kind of lists out very nicely of the progressions from direct training all the way to transformation to derived relational responding. And when I first, started using Peak, there were a lot of questions. And that really was why I got into RT. I want to learn a little bit more. Why are they doing this? Like, how did that happen? Right? Like, why is there the train and then there's a test? And why am I not giving responses to them? What's the point? Right? And then even now, like, so after I've done all those, different RLT training, understand Peak more in, different ways, more in depth in a sense, I guess. My supervisees would come up now and be like, why are they even teaching that? And I'm like, it's not about that. It's not about the stimulants here, right? We're not really caring about the Greek gods and the Greek gods and the Italian gods, how they're related.
Yeah.
We're just teaching the concept. We're just using the stimulus that they're not familiar with and teach the concept so that when they understand the concept, they're able to kind of bring that same concept, same skills where they relate things together to the outside world, to the real world, so that they're able to continue in responding in that sense, right? Just making connections. And I think it's important to understand for, a lot of clinicians too, that with the peak, you still kind of have to understand what RFT is,
Yeah.
right? You can't kind of just run the curriculum and follow curriculum strictly, then you will get to where you want to get. I think there's still a lot of understanding piece of why this is happening, even why the child is able to give you that direct relational responding. You kind of have to look into a broader context. And that comes with, how you're selecting your targets. Okay? If you use targets to teach where they already have a solid understanding, I know this is related to that, then it kind of defeats the purpose of why you're using RFD to teach the concept, because you don't know whether or not you're actually teaching the concept. You're just teaching the stimulus that they already know. So
Yeah.
they're able to put together, but you're not bridging any new skill. You're not really teaching new responses, right?
Yeah, and I mean that's a really good point too of not using the curriculum so rigidly. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think as clinicians sometimes we see concepts or we see interventions or we see curriculums and we kind of follow them to the T without realizing that we can adapt them to like fit the learner's needs. So, and you talked about not teaching concepts that they already know, but there are ways that you can do the peak in a more applicable to the learner's life way. So instead of teaching about Greek, the comparison between Greek and Italian gods, right? You may want to use, for somebody that's into sports, the relationship between like the Raptors and the Maple Leafs. How are those two related? And teach that concept, although they're totally different sports, they're totally different things, and kind of, expand and progress from there, right?
Yeah, 100%. And sometimes, like, of course, in the practice, we also use more individualized RFT
Yeah.
based program based on the learner's needs and based on, their behavioral repertoires, based on their interest and motivation too. Right. And we've been successfully teaching, different skills, including maybe like puberty training, understanding private versus public and what they mean. Because in realistically, even with ABA, like you're not able to teach the all of the skills, all of the repertoire,
Absolutely.
all of the targets, right? Because there are so many, and as long as there's a new situation, new context, they don't know how to respond, then your intervention fails, right? And that's what generalization is, and it's powerful. And in fact, last year I actually published an article on a study that I did on increasing ingestible allergen safety responses using RFD. So basically, what I did was, in the study, the participants were taught how to identify allergic reactions,
Mhm.
and then how to identify allergens, and also how to respond to them. And at the end of it, they were able to respond to they were able to respond to allergens without directly teaching the relations between the allergens and also the verbal responses, which is obviously say no to it. And it was interesting also to see that there's a big change in modality of how they're responding. Some of those individuals were actually using AAC through our training during the training, but then later on they're able to just kind of push it away. If you give them peanuts, they push it away, or they're just going to shake their hands, because all of these to them still equals no, right?
Yeah.
And within the RT we understand, and later on we put it in another phase and we say, okay, well, this thing is the same as peanuts. And then immediately, okay, do you want this? And they like, no, because they within our FT, they
Yeah.
know that if this equals that, then I'm able to kind of expand a lot more. I don't have to teach every single skill or every single, stimulus within that frame anymore. I can just tell them, this is the same as this, and they will know, okay, well, then I know the response to this is a no. And it's really powerful.
And that's
Thank
a
you.
really cool application of RFT, right? Developing that language is great and it's awesome. But, teaching somebody to be safe and prevent anaphylactic shock from a potential allergy, that's a pretty cool application. If people wanted to check out that article, where could they go?
The article is published on the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, and the title, it's a little bit long, but it's the Increasing Ingestible Allergy Safety Skill in Autistic Children Using Derived Relational Training for Effective Health and Safety Training.
That's pretty cool. We'll put a link to that in the show
Thank you.
notes as well. Switching gears a little bit, stepping a little bit away from RFT, you run Glowing Growth in Markham.
Right.
How long have you been doing that, and what inspired you to open that up?
I started that about, 2015, I think. And that's the time when I was still being supervised. I was working under the mentorship of another clinical psychologist and a BCBA, and they were supervising all of my cases. I wasn't working alone. I was always with, the psychologist and also the BCBA working together to try to, support individuals. And at that time, I was doing more home base. It's always been, home base going into the home and supporting them. But after a while, understanding there's a higher needs in, the service, I started a center. I started a center-based service. And from then on, we've expanded. Very luckily, people do trust us, and we were able to expand, and we have a lot more, BCBA now, and students who are in their master's degree earning for their BCBA hours in RBT, coming into the work, and we do a lot of training in-house training as well, also like CEUs programs, and also mentorship for a lot of our staff here. Um, I think one of the major reason why I really wanted to start something is because seeing, the lack of services at that time, and also, and what I talked about earlier is the, advocating for ABA and advocating for autistic individuals. To me, that was really big. Like, I find that, there is really very limited people talking about autistic individuals, and also behavior analysis. And I do want to, be one of those who are able to proudly say what I do,
Yeah.
and to able to obviously support the individuals who are in needs as well.
That's awesome. I feel like a lot of us kind of started that way. When you start home base, you kind of stumble on it, and
Yes,
then you kind of grow from there. And for similar reasons, right? Trying to create more opportunities for more people
yes.
to access ABA. That's pretty awesome. And you're also a part-time professor at Durham College. Um, what made you want to teach at Durham, and how has your knowledge of RFT helped you with being an effective instructor there?
I think what really, became my interest in teaching is because I find that a lot of times when I'm talking to, supervisees, the theoretical backgrounds wasn't always very strong in that sense. And a lot of, the practice, or a lot of, implementations or ideas comes from the experience, which is great, which is really great. But sometimes when you talk only experience, you don't understand why that worked there and might not work here.
Yeah.
Right? Because in your experience, oh, token board's going to work. Well, but this person doesn't really know token board, or isn't interested in, the stickers or whatnot, right? Then token board works in a way because it's a reinforcement system, and reinforcements only work if it's, increase the future likelihood of the of the behavior under the similar condition, right? And if it didn't, then your token board isn't working. Just because you have a
Yeah.
token board in place doesn't always mean that it is a reinforcement, right? And there are a lot of little things like that make me feel that, the theoretical background of why these things are working is very important. And that's why I started doing more staff training with, the supervisors that I work with. I want them to really know, the theories behind every single thing that we're doing. We're just not doing it because, oh, well, it worked before, or it looks like it's right? We really want to have the theory. And then obviously from then on, there's only so many of, supervisees or staff that I can, trade, and therefore I start seeking for opportunities in colleges. So then I could kind of bridge that gap a little bit. And also because the time when I was in school getting training to become a BCBA, there wasn't any BCABA programs, and there's not any degrees that is related to behavioral science. And I'm really proud that we started doing a lot of these, behavioral science program in Ontario because it's important to start earlier. You can't just step into, behavior analysis in your master's degree and that's how you learn everything in that 2 years, right? I think the starting point has to be a little bit earlier and with more different, theories and learning in their whole career.
I agree. I think Ontario has seen a really amazing academic growth in the field of ABA, right? Especially now that we have doctorate programs in ABA specifically. Um, and it's super exciting to see where we will continue to grow academically and how we'll continue um, to increase the knowledge of ABA in Ontario. And especially over the last 5 years, it's really boomed. Like almost every college in Ontario has a behavior science program. It's been really cool to see, and working with those folks and seeing how they're learning must be really reinforcing for yourself.
It is at the end, like, I teach a lot of like um year 4 courses, and I always ask them, so what's your ambition? Like, what are you trying to, get into? And everybody's like, oh, I applied for my master. I want to become an RBA. It's like, okay, well, that's good. Like, at least, I feel like, okay, well, I contributed a little bit, so that's good.
That's awesome. Um, if people wanted to keep learning about the work you're doing, more about you, or if they wanted to connect with you, where can they go?
I'm actually in the process of building my own CEU platform so then I can provide more, learning opportunities for anybody who is interested, whether it's RFT or just, apply clinical skills as well. They can always email me. They can always go to my work website as well. All the information can be found there. We take in a lot of master students, placement students for their hours, experience hours, and we have monthly CEUs that we do at Golden Growth as well that anybody is welcome to join if they want to. Right now, it's still a smaller scale, but we are trying to kind of expand it to make sure, we're able to bring those messages and those, implementations or strategies that we have used and it works across the board if possible. But yeah, like they can always email me, they can always go to our work website.
Amazing. We'll put the website up on our show notes. And finally, as we kind of wrap up the conversation, we talked a little bit about the growth of ABA in Ontario and how it's gone from you not knowing that your own sister was a BCBA to now being regulated and it being a more a, a, a pathway to a career for a lot more people. I think we still have a lot of work to do. So, in
Oh,
your
yes.
opinion, how can behavior analysts make ABA more accessible to the public in Ontario specifically?
So once again, I do want to say that recognitions of RB is just so incredible. Like I'm so proud of every single one of us who worked so hard to get where we're at today. Right. I know that a lot of people put in a lot of efforts to try to get us regulated, and that's really good. But AB is still not widely understood by, a lot of families or even professionals in the field. Not in the field, but like, in providing services as
Yeah.
well. But to me, I think accessibility isn't just really about availability. It's not like, you have more RBAs and then that would becomes more accessible. I think it's not just the availability, but how the service are being, designed, communicated, and delivered in that real life system that all the families are living in. We can't just stay in our own clinic and open a new clinic and then in that clinic you come and you receive service. I don't think it's we're at that service. I think now that we're regulated, we do have that professional identity, that stronger professional identity where we can expand where ABA happens. And if you know ABA, you know that ABA it's everywhere, even you going into a job and you work and you get paid, that's part of ABA. That's, reinforcement too,
Yeah,
right? But people who don't know, don't know. Right? And families who have never heard of ABA before, they just don't know. And other professionals as well can be, and on the same boat with the parents as well. So I think first we need to really expand where ABA is happening, moving beyond those clinic-based services. And I'm not just talking about, service to be at home, but more in school, community settings, recreational settings, because, we can use those strategies anywhere to support the individuals that we support as well. And also one of the good things about expanding where ABA happens outside of the clinic is that it can really reduce that burden on the families that you're just paying for this one-on-one services outside of school. If we're able to go into school, we're able to support the learners in a more natural environments where they are actually at and learning. Not every individual needs to be required that one-on-one ABA time outside of school. I think it's important that we understand that too.
that's amazing. That's some really good advice and some actionable items there for us to figure out how we can make ABA more accessible. Because I do think it's an important thing, and I do think we can help a lot more people than we currently are. We just need a little bit more of that dissemination in those conversations.
Right. And I think now that we're being recognized under the college, it's our responsibility, obligations to advocate within the regulated
Yes,
framework in Ontario, right? Like how are the policies being, in place? The conversations about funding models, conversations about insurance recognitions, right? The public knowledge and understanding of ABAs are still very much lacking. Right.
absolutely.
And I think that, it requires all of us as behavior analysts in Ontario to really step up and start talking about us.
I agree. I agree. I think that's a really good way to wrap up the episode. Talk a little bit more about us and share a little bit more about what ABA can do outside of our clinic walls and outside of our developmental disability world. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ida, for joining us. It was such a great conversation. I really enjoyed the chat. And yeah, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. I'm so glad to be here.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye bye.